Which actions would you consider the most ludicrous to be committed by an airline or a pilot? Whatever you decide, I can nearly promise you that it will be mentioned in this narrative. It is a terrifying description of how disregarding maintenance SIRON training and basic common sense may allow for the breach of every safety barrier. Pay attention. Although the main emphasis of this account will be the events of Aeroflot North Flight 821, some background information about the pilots and the airline involved is necessary in order to completely comprehend and appreciate the seriousness of the situation. In 1963, Aeroflot North was established in the Soviet Union under the name Archangel's United Aviation Squadron. It remained a mostly regional domestic operator until 2004, when Aeroflot, the Russian flag carrier at the time, purchased 51% of its equity and changed its name to Aeroflot North, making it a strictly regional Aeroflot subsidiary. The management soon realized that they would have to start purchasing aircraft constructed in the West in order to continue developing, and this was the start of a highly successful corporate growth. They decided to use the Boeing 737-500 since it was the ideal size and reasonable price for the intended growth. The corporation purchased 12 737s, and Russian aviation authorities approved their operation in 2060. However, it seems that the authorities did not thoroughly examine the methods for integrating these aircraft into the current fleet or training Aeroflot North's pilots to fly them. Because the only aircraft in Aeroflot North's fleet until the 737 arrived were those made in the Soviet Union, including the Tupolev 154, Tupolev 134, Antonov 24, and Antonov 26. All of them aircraft had one thing in common. They needed a flight crew of 3 or sometimes 4 people. The navigator handled en route navigation, while the flight engineer handled the engines. In addition to a significant shift in technical system knowledge, the pilots who would now be operating the Boeing 737's more contemporary two-pilot cockpit also needed to adapt to a new flying philosophy and crew resource management, which was far more significant than most people realized at the time. Additionally, all of the 737's manuals and system explanations were only accessible in English, a language that these Russian pilots could only vaguely grasp. Up until this point, these pilots had only flown domestically in Russia, so they had never really needed to learn English properly. Of course, any pilot flying in international airspace had to have a fully functioning understanding of the language. On top of this, the pilots who would ultimately fly Flight 821 were very new to their jobs. Having flown on the Soviet-type Tupolev 134 and the Antonov U, the 35-year-old captain had just 3,900 hours of total flying experience. Despite having only served as a first officer on those aircraft, he was promoted to captain on the Boeing 713 hours on this brand new aircraft. This indicated that he was a rookie captain and new to the type at the time of the tragedy. He completed type rating training on the 737 in the United States. However, we are unsure of his performance since the training records were lost. However, we were aware that his future line training and check-in records also had a number of inconsistencies, suggesting that Aeroflot North did not adhere to their own state to meticulously verify the training programs. The captain had taken more over the required minimum of 15 hours of rest before to reporting for Flight 821, but he had been flying lengthy night flights for the 3 days prior, with many major violations of minimum rest standards, which may have contributed to his potential accumulation of tiredness. For instance, on one of these instances, he barely got 6 hours of sleep rather than the recommended 12. According to reports, his proficiency in English was at a decent level, similar to a core level 2 out of 6. This level would not be sufficient for international travel, but it was still much superior to that of his coworker, who we will discuss next. The first officer was 43 years old and had flown 900 hours in total, more than the captain, but 7,000 of those hours had been spent aboard the outdated Antonov 2, which was powered by Soviet propellers. After completing 1,600 hours of flying experience on the Tupolev of 134, he switched to the Boeing 737, of which he had just 236 hours at the time of the trip. In a training facility in St. Petersburg, he had finished his typewriting instruction for the 737. Petersburg and the documents revealed that he had been having a lot of trouble throughout that course, particularly with the usage of English. This had made it difficult for him to grasp the manuals and systems and to follow the regular operating procedures, but more importantly for this narrative, he has shown difficulties in managing the aircraft when there was a lot of asymmetric thrust or after-engine failures. Both pilots had previously flown Soviet aircraft, such as the Antonov 2, which had a single engine, or the Tupolev 134, which had engines in close proximity to one another. The impact of thrust asymmetry, such as in the event of an engine failure or malfunction, will be far less severe if the engines are near to one another, since the momentum arm from the still-running engine will be less. Pilots would have to utilize rudder to offset the yawing motion on the Boeing 737, which has engines hanging below the wings and far from the center of the aircraft, much more fiercely than they were used to. The first officer apparently had a lot of trouble with this. It should be mentioned that pilots from Soviet-style aircraft often had flight engineers control the thrust levels. Thus, in some situations, they wouldn't have even done so themselves. However, as I previously said, the first officer's English language proficiency was the primary cause of his issues. Before joining the type rating, he had finished an advanced aviation technical English course and a beginner's course. However, the school that had given him this training was later discovered to be unaccredited and to have employed teachers who lacked valid teaching experience and English language proficiency. It is also noteworthy that the airline curricula had no explicit instruction for aircraft upset avoidance and recovery, despite the pilots having undergone frequent training and check-in after the completion of their type rating. Thus, the pilot's tale brings us to the aircraft they plan to fly on this journey, which is likewise crucial to the events that are about to transpire. This last report in English is really available to us since the aircraft, named Victor Papa Bravo Kilo Oscar, was registered in Bermuda. The aircraft, a Boeing 737-505 with 44,533 hours on the airframe, has been flown by another airline in China before. With this aircraft, there were a few oddities that would all be significant to the plot. This aircraft, in the first place, was equipped with a different kind of flight director than the majority of the other 737s in the Aeroflot North Fleet. The earlier integrated Q or V-bars type, which uses a V-shaped aircraft sign to follow a magenta V-shaped guide, was used in place of the conventional command bars. The aeroplane emblem is shaped like that guidance B. Do not forget that. A key distinction between Soviet and Western-style attitude indicators should also be noted here. Western instruments essentially replicate the view pilots perceive when they gaze out their windows by having the horizon move within the instrument while the aircraft symbol remains stationary. However, with Soviet attitude indicators, the horizon remains stationary while the aircraft symbol moves, giving pilots the impression that they are sitting level behind the aircraft and seeing it move in respect to the horizon. For ex-Soviet pilots, the shift to flying Western aircraft is made more difficult by this little but significant difference, particularly if the aircraft begins to adopt extreme attitudes when situational awareness and fast decision-making are essential. It's also crucial to be aware that this aircraft has a documented history of thrust lever issues. With the thrust levers close to each other, the right engine would create a lot more thrust than the left, since the two thrust levers seem to be trimmed differently in the intermediate position. The fact that this was not the case at maximum or minimum thrust lever angles suggested that either the engine trim or the right engine's internal temperature probe was malfunctioning. The outer throttle would, In any event, stagger the truss levers, essentially raising the left truss lever above the right in order to equalize and correct for the truss output. The cruise truss split monitoring system is a system that is included into the outer throttle. Only under certain circumstances would that mechanism disconnect the outer throttle if there is an excessive disparity between the truss levers. This actually happened several times on this aircraft in the days prior to the accident flight, but the engineering firm hired to perform maintenance for Aeroflot North chose to simply mark the outer throttle as inoperative rather than investigating the underlying cause of the disconnect. Maintainers must now take out the related circuit breakers, attach collars to them, and label the outside throttle switch with an INNOP sticker similar to this one in order to fully disable the system. The crews had simply ignored the notation in the tech log and kept using the outside throttle system since it was somewhat simpler, but none of it had been done correctly. The crew, 2 pilots, and 4 cabin crew members arrived at Moscow Sheremetyevo Airport at around 1:30 local time on September 13, 2008. The captain came a little later with the other members of the cabin staff, while the first officer arrived first with 3 of them. After passing the normal medical inspection, they all walked to the crew room to review the pre-flight paperwork. The pilots checked the weather and found that there were no thumbs, so it seemed to be a typical passenger flight from Moscow to Perm with 82 people scheduled. Although some rain and fog were predicted for their location, it wasn't severe enough to be a major worry. The aircraft was parked at stand 22, so they went outside and began getting it ready to take off. Upon reviewing the tech record, the captain saw that although the outside throttle was indicated as inoperative, it had not been disabled. Enabled, and as no technical staff was available to inquire, he probably believed it might be used until it malfunctioned again. Although the aircraft's TCAS system was the other non-functional component of the tech job, it wasn't a big deal since they were permitted to function without it. Since the first officer would be piloting, he began preparing the cockpit while the captain conducted the external check. It is now necessary to align the inertial reference system as part of the Boeing 737's cockpit configuration. Following the entry of a starting location, the aircraft's position is tracked by a system of laser gyros and accelerometers. These gyros are prone to drifting, which means that once they are aligned, they will only be really accurate for a little period of time before requiring assistance from other navigation systems to correct them. GPS are used to achieve this in more recent aircraft, but this one was not equipped with one. Thus, it would have to depend on cross-checking radio aids along the way, mainly VUR-DME stations, to update its location. However, there were no such stations near enough to be utilized on this specific route, which was the issue. Consequently, the IRS system, the main method for updating the location of the aeroplane on the navigation display, would get more and more erroneous with time. The IRS inaccuracy was around 1 nautical mile from the beginning since the first officer had entered their starting coordinate incorrectly. However, the information that pilots get from the navigation display is essentially a backup that somewhat eases our life. We must constantly confirm our location using raw data instruments, such as the VUR or NDB needles or the ILS pointers, throughout instrument circumstances and during flight phases when navigation accuracy is crucial. Therefore, a map shift, which indicates that the navigation display is not entirely accurate, should not be a major issue, but we'll talk more about that later. The first officer asked for pushback after the captain gave a welcoming PA to the passengers when everyone was ready. At 3:06 local time, 6 minutes later, the aircraft began taxiing out for departure from runway 07 left. We know that the inoperative outer throttle was activated just before departure, but we don't know how well the standard operating procedures were followed because the aircraft's cockpit voice recorder only recorded the last 30 minutes of flight, so there were regrettably no cockpit voice recordings available for the taxi-out phase. Even if it shouldn't have, it did. Given that a first officer would be piloting, the protocol required that the captain turn over the controls to him once the aircraft was properly aligned. Before pressing the toga buttons and calling for takeoff thrust to be established, the first officer should have gradually raised the thrust to around 40% N1. Then, they should have allowed the engine to stabilize there since they could accelerate at varied rates at first. This is a crucial safety measure to ensure that the takeoff roll is started appropriately and to prevent any loss of control at low speeds because to asymmetric thrust. Here, however, such was not the case. Instead, since the engines were not correctly trimmed, the captain pushed the thrust levels ahead during the lineup turn to a 55-degree angle, which meant a thrust of 70.5% and 1 on the left engine and 84% on the right. This implied that he gave the first officer with a large thrust imbalance all the controls in the midst of the lineup turn. Since of this, the first officer had to align the aircraft with the center line by giving full left rudder first, and then almost full right rudder to maintain the center line since the right engine was now pulling more than the left. Because of this needless increase in complexity and labor, the toga buttons were never pressed, and as a result, the proper takeoff thrust was not set. Consequently, during the first 20 seconds, the initial acceleration was slower than usual. The flight directors would have been triggered when someone, probably the captain, finally pressed the toga buttons after the aircraft had reached around 90 knots. However, the proper takeoff thrust was still not set since the outer throttle enters a throttle hold mode at 84 knots, even though the thrust should have been set at 60 knots. This is the responsibility of the pilot monitoring, in this instance the captain, to keep track of if something is indeed completed. 2 seconds after the takeoff rotation, the thrust was finally set to 88% and 1 on both engines. This indicates that the pilots were not following standard procedures from the start of the flight and appeared to have a basic lack of knowledge about the automatic systems of border aircraft. Autopilot B, which would remain engaged for the duration of the trip, was finally activated by the first officer as the aircraft continued to ascend eastward. The FNC used the Moscow VOR to update their location shortly after they left. However, this just changed the position on the navigation display. The IRS continued to drift at a speed of around 1 to 2 nautical miles per hour, and the IRS location remained incorrect. By 0.330 in the morning, the aircraft had climbed to its cruising altitude of just under 30,000 feet, or 9,100 meters. I'm going to stick with utilizing meters for all height references in Russian airspace instead. During the cruise phase of this flight, the auto totals remained linked, maintaining a 13 to 15 thrust level staggered degrees due to the two engines' disparate thrust outputs. Since of this stagger, there was no side slip, and the autopilot had no trouble handling the N1 since it was equal on both engines. As far as we know, the flight proceeded without any significant issues throughout the cruise as long as the requirements for the cruise thrust split monitoring system were not met, and the outside throttle remained operational. By the time the plane was around 200 kilometers or 110 nautical miles from Perham Airport, the pilots began talking about which arrival and approach they would probably be flying. As an additional distinction between flying in Russia and the West, they were also talking about the local QFE configuration. For their altimeters, the Russians often employ a pressure setting called QFE, which, when activated, displays the aircraft's height above the landing airport rather than the altitude above sea level, which is what we in the West usually use. Now that the arrival and approach routes were not accessible from the FNC memory, the first officer attempted to load them into the flight management computer. This caused him to have to program the waypoints manually, something he was struggling greatly with. He was asking the captain for a lot of assistance since he just didn't seem to see the reasoning behind FNC programming. It seems that the crew entirely neglected to finish the approach briefing and the descent checklist since this task took much longer than he had anticipated. As far as crew resource management is concerned, this is a very major omission since the approach briefing not only verifies that everything is set up correctly, but it also lays out the strategy for the approach so that both pilots are on the same page. Additionally, It's when we usually talk about potential hazards like terrain or runway modifications and how we'll handle them. So missing it is just not an option. At this point, the captain phoned the air traffic controller and asked that the descent begin. The controller responded and gave them the all clear to drop to 4,500 meters, or around 14,000 feet, first. Once they reached 5,100 meters, they were to get in touch with the approach controller. The first officer at the mode control panel set the new cleared altitude without making any callouts, and the captain failed to cross-check the established altitude, which is another serious procedural violation. These kinds of omissions, along with a general lack of communication about autopilot mode changes, FMA changes, and clearances, persisted throughout the descent. In fact, it appears that this cockpit has not used any of the crucial safety barriers that have been installed in the wake of numerous other tragic accidents. The captain was not at his best even before the approach began, as shown by a number of odd little mistakes in addition to these procedural ones, such as mistaking their call sign for the wrong heights for pressurization checks, etc. Now, during the descent, they broke the sterile cockpit rule by disparaging the cabin crew and their traffic controller for no apparent reason at all. They also spoke about other non-operational topics. There was no thrust asymmetry, since the autopilot modes that were used were LNAV and VNAV, which offered an idle descent. However, this will soon change. As an example, the captain might instruct the first officer to take the radio, signifying that he was assuming charge instead, but he would still do other duties, such as activating the engine anti-ice, which is also a pilot monitoring responsibility. All the time, intermittently entering control information. Adherence to areas of duty is the fundamental tenet upon which we operate the Boeing 737. Accordingly, certain jobs are always completed by the pilot flying, while others are completed by the pilot monitoring. In a two-pilot cockpit, it's crucial to reduce uncertainty about who should do what and when, but this obviously didn't happen in this instance. The first officer, who was presumably performing both pilot flying and pilot monitoring duties at the time, reported the aircraft passing 5,100 meters at 0.049 and 30 seconds. The air traffic controller instructed the officer to contact a PARM approach controller on a new frequency. The first officer who checked in was instructed to descend to 2,700 meters and then use the Mendeleevo 4 Bravo arrival route going forward. In the flight management computer, the first officer had prepared for the arrival of the Mendeleevo 4 Alpha, but he read it back inaccurately after properly reading the altitude clearance. The first officer was not ready for this change in strategy, so even though he now read back the right clearance, the controller's correction seemed to considerably confuse him. The crew would have to do a lot of various maneuvers to go in over the final for runway 03, then out to a locating beacon known as the Papa X-ray, and finally a base turn towards the ILS for runway 21. A much easier straight approach to a location named Sindra, and a turn towards the ILS, which is probably the one they would typically get, was the arrival route that the crew had planned for. The crew did not do a rebriefing of any type, despite the fact that this arrival was quite different. This rather odd arrival path was really caused by a Lufthansa Airbus, a 319, that was removing the departing aircraft from Parham and had asked to take off from runway 03 because of a small breeze on runway 21, the landing runway. The departure traffic and the landing of aircraft 18 would be further separated by this new arrival path. To one, although the controllers had no real plans to alter the runway for landing. As the crew began talking about how to actually fly this novel route, the first officer inquired as to what made Bravo unique. A member of the cabin staff interrupted this conversation by going into the cockpit to inform the pilots that the sign to secure seatbelts had not yet been turned on. In response, the captain said it was too early for that, but it was absolutely time to wear that. When someone in the team reminds you of something you forgot, you should always appreciate them and follow through. The main thing is what is right, not who is right. However, it seems that the captain has decided that asking the cabin staff member for a cup of tea would be a better idea than doing that. During the descent and during this complex shift of navigation, she was probably preoccupied with her own processes, which is perhaps why she had first reminded them of the seatbelt warning. Again, this is a pretty odd thing to prioritize, but it's unclear whether he ever received that t-shirt. The controller arrived and explained the new arrival path to the crew at 4:50 and 37 seconds. According to him, aerofoil at 21 should be approached by auto marker. For your information, aircraft are lined up to leave, but the wind is not favorable for them as they move towards 212. The team was given a very complicated explanation of the cause, and it seems that this has just made their confusion worse. "What will we do now?" the first officer asked. "Current course." Calling the controller, who had regained control of the radio, the captain inquired about the wind. He was informed that R21 was experiencing a tailwind of 5.7 meters per second, or around 11 knots. The controller then returned and said that he had merely explained to them why the Lufthansa crew had changed their takeoff trajectory. He replied that this was a tailwind that they allowed. The captain eventually inquired as to which path to take in order to wrap up this conversation, and the controller replied with Papa X-ray, the auto marker. The captain read back, "Course to the auto marker, Roger," but he did not specify whether this was done directly to the auto marker or via the already approved arrival path. It's clear from these conversations that a great deal of uncertainty had begun to develop in the cockpit, and the controller's interactions with them surely didn't help. As a result of the tailwind conversation, it seems that the pilots, particularly the first officer, began to believe that they had been approved into a pattern for landing on runway 03 rather than runway 21. The pilots didn't bother to ask the controller to reaffirm which runway they might anticipate, even though he mentioned it many times throughout the course of the next several minutes. After this, the pilot began to sound quite irritated, and a speech analysis of the audio recording revealed that he was probably under more stress as the flight went on. When the first officer questioned the captain of the landing runway as they approached the airport, he was simply informed that the controller would provide the information. This misunderstanding over the runway only grew in the cockpit. In the end, however, it seems that the captain added the ILS runway 21 to the FNC without telling his first officer that it was probably going to be the ILS runway 21 after all. A second violation of the captain's normal operating procedures occurred when the plane fell through 10,000 feet without him performing a pressurization check. Now, do you recall the IRS drift I discussed earlier? As the aircraft approached its destination, the drift rose to around 4.5 kilometers. This meant that the aeroplane's location on the navigation display was 4.5 kilometers farther to the northeast than its real position. This will soon become a major issue. The crew should have checked the NDB needle to see that the aircraft wasn't actually trekking towards their cleared waypoint, but the frequency for the Papa X-ray hadn't been tuned in, probably because the approach briefing wasn't finished and the NDB needle didn't really indicate anything. On his radar screen, the approach controller could see that the plane was not heading for the Papa X-ray beacon as he had instructed, but he wasn't too concerned since it actually gave the leaving Airbus more spacing than he had intended. It was now authorized for the aircraft to drop to 2,700 meters, or around 8,000 feet, before waiting for more permission. The autotrotters began moving the thrust levels forward to maintain the speed when they reached the cleared altitude, since the pilots were using level change for the descent, which meant that the thrust levels stayed in idle. As a result, they once more moved to different angles to maintain the same thrust output. The autotrotter was unable to make this adjustment right away, so some thrust asymmetry was created and the control wheel began to shift in order to compensate. The pilots, however, were too preoccupied with agreeing on the path of the next turn to notice this. The captain believed they would be given a left turn to base so they could intercept the ILS immediately, while the first officer anticipated a right turn for a downwind leg, which would be required since they were still much too high to begin the ILS approach. The controller interrupted this conversation by ordering them to drop to 2,100 meters and then turn right towards the rear course, which is the opposite direction from the landing runway. Unfortunately, he still failed to provide the precise location of the landing runway. He believed the crew was aware of this. Even though the first officer believed that this would be a right turn for runway 03, the captain was certain that the controller was referring to runway 21, which was in fact accurately. I just want to say now how completely ridiculous it was that they were now above the runway and still arguing about which runway they should land on. This was just the start, however. Even before the controller gave the crew the all-clear to make the right turn, the flight management computer had already begun the turn since it was probably set up to go straight to the runway 21 threshold point after the Papa X-ray, and the aircraft were still in LNAV. The first officer became very confused and yelled, "Where is it going? I don't understand where it's going." This is never a good thing to hear from a pilot. The aircraft was unable to reach this threshold point at the speed they were flying, which was about 220 knots at the time. Instead, it began turning left to return to this point. At this moment, the skipper made the wise decision to instruct the first officer to engage heading select instead. Additionally, as they continued to drop, he instructed him to turn right and go 0 to 30 degrees towards downwind. At 2,100 meters, the aircraft began leveling off at times 0 to 4:59 and 23 seconds. The thrust levers began to move forward in an attempt to meet the thrust demand as a result, and a notable thrust asymmetry once again began to form. However, since the aircraft was in a right turn and the right engine was generating greater power, this resulted in a left roll component and side slip, which required the autopilot to apply even more right aileron in order to finish the turn. As a result, the spoilers rose over the right wing's threshold value, ultimately meeting the conditions needed for the crew's thrust split monitoring system to activate and switch off the autotrol. At that point, both pilots recognized that an autotrol caution light had illuminated. The first officer was instructed by the captain to continue flying by manual propulsion, which further increased the complexity of the situation. Because the first officer was now manually operating the thrust levers, he pushed them in unison. This meant that the engines would now begin to produce a significant amount of asymmetric thrust going forward because of the thrust trimming's ongoing failure. The first officer never identified the asymmetric thrust and, as a result, did not apply any opposing rudder to offset it. This was because none of the pilots kept an eye on the real N1 on the engine displays. This meant that the aircraft had to be kept on the right path by the autopilot moving the control wheel. This worked for a time, but only while the autopilot was truly activated. It was now time to drop to 600 meters, the ILS intercept height, or around 2,000 feet, after the aircraft had finally settled on the downwind track 45 seconds after 5 a.m. Since runway 2.1 was the only runway in perm with an ILS approach, the crew finally knew which runway they were going to land on 12 minutes after the captain's first question, and confirmation of an ILS approach led to the controller's confirmation. In order to get the aircraft to descend, along with flap 1, without any callouts, the pitch mode level change was now chosen. Nevertheless, the thrust levers were not changed to idle. The aircraft began to accelerate towards 232 knots since the first officer had left the thrust at a rather high amount. In the event of a level change, the aircraft will not descend until the thrust is decreased. Nothing will really happen if the push is sufficient to sustain the chosen speed, since level change is a pitch mode designed mainly to do just that. When the outside throttle is engaged, this is never an issue since, depending on the level change chosen, it will set the climb thrust for climbing or the idle thrust for descending. But when using manual thrust, you are responsible for your own care. The first officer was ordered to decrease the speed to 190 knots and begin applying the speed brake by the captain, who must have noticed the excessive speed. The thrust was now decreased to idle again, But as the aircraft would prioritize speed when changing levels, in this instance, it was slowing down to the new desired speed without really beginning a descent until that was achieved. The first officer seemed to be perplexed by this and repeatedly questioned why it wasn't dropping as they continued to choose more flaps and further decrease the speed at the same time. After calling the aircraft up, the controller informed them that they were still at 1,800 meters and around 16 kilometers from the airport. He also inquired whether they were indeed descending. When the first officer responded, 600 meters, the captain became enraged and yelled, "How long must we descend? How long must we descend?" The captain immediately called this back to the controller, who was obviously aware of this since he had given the go-ahead for them to descend to that altitude. After this, the captain began to behave in a very insane manner, and the examination of his voice revealed that he was under a lot of stress. He then began to ask the controller if they could start the right turn to intercept the ILS, which was inappropriate given their current location since they were still more than twice as high as they needed to be to maintain them at 1,700 meters or 5,200 feet. At that distance, record the glide slope. Following their descent through the transition level, the controller requested confirmation from the crew that the local pressure had been set on the altimeters. The captain then requested to turn back towards the final after confirming that they had. The approach checklist was meant to be triggered by setting the QFE, but this was never done either. In reality, the first officer's altimeter had the QFE pressure setting set, not the captain's, which is what the approach checklist was meant to detect. The controller ultimately gave up when the captain requested a third turn inbound, allowing them to turn base when they were ready. It was evident that he believed it was still too high to begin the approach when he told them that they were 20 kilometers from the runway, or around 10.8 nautical miles. Why, therefore, did the skipper choose to make this early turn inbound? All right, recall our previous discussion of the IRS drift. The navigation display, which indicated a location around 4.5 kilometers farther northeast than they were, was probably what the captain was staring down at. They would still have been rather high, but not as high as they were today, even with that inaccuracy in. The turn to see the final began at 0.05, 0.04, and 15 seconds. The skipper chose to drop the landing gear and extend the flaps to 15 in order to enhance the drag, since they were more than twice as high as they should be. However, since he instructed the first officer to drop the speed as well, the aircraft first lowered the fall rate in order to reach this lower speed, which put them even higher above the profile. The aircraft would have captured the ILS localizer around 9 kilometers from the runway rather than the required 12.6 kilometers if it had rolled out on a heading of 160 degrees to intercept it, preventing them from following the glide, which would be well below them. However, from the cockpit, it seemed like they would intercept at a distance of around 14 kilometers. Since the glide slopes would have been fully deflected behind the ILS pointers, which would have been visible on his EADI at this time, it is probable that the first officer saw the issue. Since he was now speaking with the approach controller, who was passing them along to the ground controller, the captain did not reply when he requested flap 30. Thus, it took 2 more calls for the first officer to get the captain to respond. And he gave a very shivering response. "Do it yourself," he urged. "Flaps, thrust, MCP adjustments, everything." Saying that to a less seasoned colleague in the midst of a very complex, dynamic, and rapidly evolving scenario is one of the worst instances of CRM I have ever seen. As the aircraft reached the approved height of 600 meters, it was fully outfitted with gear down and landing flaps. In any event, flaps 30 was ultimately chosen, most likely by the first officer himself. Things are going to start moving swiftly from now on. As the aircraft leveled off, the autopilot continued to operate, causing the speed to drop quickly from 150 knots to less than 130, which was the minimum for flap 30. The aircraft was now creating a lot of drag because it was in landing configuration. The first officer's type rating included criticism that he was not very good at anticipating how much trust he would need when extending flaps, and instead tended to simply react to speed changes with erratic trust level movements. This is precisely what occurred today, and his second known weakness, trust asymmetry, resurfaced as he began to add more trust. The still engaged autopilot began to input aileron in an attempt to prevent the side slide. More aileron was required, however, since the speed had dropped considerably, and the autopilot soon reached its 25-degree control wheel input limit. Now that it was near its limit, the aircraft began to roll gently to the left at a rate of around 2 degrees per second. Both the first officer, who was preoccupied with speed control, and the captain, who was conversing with the ground controller about the weather and clearly not keeping any eye on the flying, failed to detect this at first. The roll mode LNAB was picked at 0.05, 0.06, and 44 seconds, most likely by error, and was swiftly switched to Vorlach. When the left roll hit 32 degrees 4 seconds later, the first officer must have glanced down and noticed. His first response was to apply right aileron, but since the autopilot was still in operation, it switched from Vorlach to control wheel steering roll, a lower level of automation that essentially functions as a servo in response to control from the pilot. The first cop was likely unfamiliar with control wheel steering, and as he kept pressing the buttons, he unintentionally pushed the vehicle forward, which also activated control wheel steering pitch. At that time, he was frantically attempting to comprehend what was going on while piloting the aeroplane in landing mode with manual thrust control and control wheel steering. Although he was able to control the roll at first, the undermounted engine began tilting the aircraft's nose upward, generating a rise, since he also put a lot of force to get the speed back. 20 seconds later, he probably unintentionally pressed his York's electric trim button switch, which caused the autopilot to disengage. The first officer instantly lowered the thrust after realizing that the excessive push had caused the speed to grow to 160 knots. However, the aeroplane kept climbing, thus the speed is now rapidly wiped out, returning to 110 knots, which is 20 knots slower than the required speed for flap 30. What was the captain doing at that time? Since the aircraft was really on the center line, the flight director grabbed it once he resumed the Vorlach mode, before even checking the aircraft's attitude. The aircraft pitched up again when he glanced down and saw the low speed and yelled increase. The first officer, who was under a lot of stress, replied by setting almost full power. Now that they had reached 900 meters, the controller could clearly see that they were more over 300 meters above their proper altitude. Now, he questioned the pilots about whether they were indeed ascending. As a result, the captain instructed the first officer to check the vertical speed indicator and then, after a little delay, certify to the controller that they were in fact rising. The controller instructed the crew to veer right and drop to 600 meters after determining that there was no way for them to land from their current location. This basically put a stop to the approach, but the captain disagreed. Instead, he spent the next minute attempting to persuade the controller to allow them to land without making a second approach, which must now be considered utterly insane. And worse, he made many sudden control inputs to the right throughout this long conversation with the controller, which caused the bank to move from 17 degrees right to 50 degrees right a few seconds later, causing the bank angle alert to go off. Recall that around this time, the first officer was still attempting to fly manually. Is everything all right with the crew? Even the controller felt the conversation he was having with the captain was a little odd, and the captain never answered. "Where are you? What are you doing?" was the first officer's cry after the bank angle warning, and he amazingly got the plane back from that severe right bank. However, the aircraft dipped up to 15 degrees again during this time, resulting in another quick ascent and a subsequent reduction in speed to 113 knots. When the thrust levels were advanced once again between 0.05, 0.08, and 25 seconds, additional thrust asymmetry resulted, which started a left roll at a rate of around 1 degree per second. It seems that the first officer just quit up for the next 25 seconds, since there was no input in pitch, roll, or thrust. When the bank again hit 30 degrees left and the speed started to drop, the first officer simply said, "Really, just take it." Given the roller coaster the aircraft had been on for a few minutes at this time, the pilot was reportedly taken aback by this, which was really not fair. "Take what? I can't do it either," he said. Suddenly, the controls were taken in any case, and the bank angle was immediately increased to 76 degrees as they began to input aileron to the left, the same direction in which they were now rolling. Upon seeing this, the first officer cried out in the other direction, which seemed to temporarily assist. However, the captain proceeded to make a number of sudden inputs in both directions. The skipper made his last error throughout this terrible flight at times 0.05, 0.09, and 14 seconds by entering his joke with almost all left input. The Western-style EADI, particularly with the V-bar flight director, most certainly contributed to the captain's eventual loss of situational awareness. This would have placed the V-bar flight director below the horizon and indicating a right bank, which is what he needed to do to recover. He rolled in the incorrect way since, in his disoriented condition, the V-bar's appearance somewhat reminded him of the aviation emblem from his last plane, which would have suggested the exact opposite. This caused the aircraft to pitch down to a 65-degree angle from which it was unable to recover, resulting in an almost complete barrel roll while still in landing gear. In a 30-degree left-banked turn, the aircraft struck the ground at 250 knots, instantly killing all 88 persons on board. The aircraft struck a section of the Trans-Siberian Railway during the accident, causing significant damage, but fortunately, no one on the ground was injured. Since the accident occurred near the airport, both local firemen and airport rescue staff were able to locate the aircraft immediately. However, they were limited to securing the area and beginning the search for the black boxes. After a while, they were located, but they were badly damaged. The detectives were astonished to see what they had discovered. Pilots lost situational awareness and eventually aircraft control due to low technical understanding, non-compliance with normal operating procedures, and almost non-existent CRM. However, that wasn't even the worst. It was found that just before the aeroplane took off, one of the passengers had reportedly texted a buddy in the UK. Because the captain had just made a PA and sounded completely inebriated, the message said that the sender was really afraid. Although the first alcohol test on the captain's body has shown negative results, this prompted a subsequent test using more precise methods, which verified that the captain's blood had between 0.5 and 1 promille of alcohol at the time of the accident. At the time of their departure, their alcohol content would have been much greater. Off, which would have explained the hazy, slurry PA. The captain's speech manner from the beginning of the approach suggested elevated stress levels, which together with the potential accumulation of weariness, probably explained why he eventually lost control as well. The Russian aviation authorities, the airline, the maintenance organization, and the air traffic controllers on duty that evening were all severely criticized by the investigators. 40 safety suggestions were made in all, some of which were so comprehensive as to completely eradicate other flaws that were discovered throughout the research. Some of these, however, included improving pilot training, such as instruction for opposite prevention and recovery, ensuring that pilots are proficient in English, and providing additional training and inspections for pilots switching from Soviet to Western aircraft. Though I must admit that this is probably the exception that proves the rule, this is the first report I have seen where the entire system appears to have failed, from the initial training to the maintenance, personal accountability, rules and regulations, and the aircraft itself. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Stay safe, and see you in the next one.